Hello, today I am taking the eMotion sensors from LinknLink and pitting them against the long-standing champion of mmWave presence sensors, the Aqara FP2, which I've been using around my home for years to see how they stack up. Hi, I'm James, and I've been building out my smart home for years, with products from just about every manufacturer out there, figuring out what works and what doesn't. Now, these are actually my first products from LinknLink, who have been kind enough to send me a little care package, including their latest eMotion Pro and Max mmWave presence sensors, and a couple of other products I'll show you in future videos, so subscribe to stay tuned for those. But first things first, let's open up these eMotion sensors and see what's inside. So on the face of it, these sensors both seem pretty similar. Both use a radar to detect presence of up to 4 targets at once. They include brightness sensors and infrared blasters, and can use a separately purchased sensor cable to power them and report the temperature and humidity of the room that they are in. But this Pro model actually supports detecting targets over a longer distance of around 6 to 7 meters using its 24 GHz radar, whereas the new 2025 Max model can only reach a 4 to 5 meter distance using its higher precision 60 GHz radar. And interestingly, the Max model does not report its infrared capabilities to Home Assistant for some strange reason, but the Pro model does. So watch out for that if you want to control any IR devices with them. Given these specs and how closely the Max model stacks up against the Aqara FP2, I think I'm going to focus on this device for this review, as it matches it on every single spec except for the fact it also has an IR blaster on the one hand, but it also supports fewer zones, though I've never personally needed more than 4 in a room anyway. While we're here though, a nice thing that the Pro model claims to do is show the distance of a target to the sensor and whether or not it's approaching or moving away from the sensor, which could open up some interesting automation opportunities. But since the Max model also reports the speed of each target, you could also work out on the Max model whether or not a target is approaching as well. Anyway, now that the Max one is set up and configured, let's go and get it fitted in my kitchen. As you can see, I've just gone and stuck the eMotion Max right next to my existing FP2 for the fairest comparison. But don't worry, the Aqara will be turned off whilst testing to avoid interference with one another. It was at this point whilst up a ladder that I realised I'd done something a bit silly, sticking down the intermediary pad on the sensor with the cable plugged in, when I knew that I was going to borrow the existing cable from the FP2, which meant I had to unstick the pad to unplug the supplied cable and plug the other one in. So that is a small negative mark against this sensor in terms of mounting. Since it's not magnetic like some of the other models, you can't really move it around as easily to try and find the right spot for it, unless you don't mind using and removing a lot of sticky tape around your house. Now, with it added into my smart home and mounted in my kitchen, I could finally start configuring its zones. This process was refreshingly simple, coming from the somewhat finicky Aqara app interface. However, this was also where I ran into my biggest frustration with this device. As I'm going through the settings for each of the zones, you can see all those handy options. You give it a name, a color, set notifications, and you configure the time you have to be in or out of the zone for it to change state. And it's this setting here which will likely decide whether or not this device stays in use in my home. As you can see here, they have this slightly clunky time picker, which appears to let you set hours, minutes, and seconds from 0 to 59 or 23 for the hours. But if you set the hours and minutes to 0, it pops the seconds up to 1. You cannot set the detection time for a zone to be immediate. Now, I can appreciate from a technical perspective why you might smooth out the data a little when working with something as precise as a 60 GHz radar and trying to use that to work out which 1 meter square a human is in, and why it might be a minimum of 1 second timeout for leaving the zone so people don't flicker in and out constantly when they're on the edge. But when entering a zone, you want that to trigger immediately. Otherwise, zones are borderline pointless in my opinion. Let me try and explain why I think that. You see, when you enter a room, if it takes a second to turn the lights on, it's not the end of the world because you might only get a step or 2 into the room. But then you have your primary lights as long as you are in there. Pretty similar to flicking a light switch. But when you enter a smaller zone within a room, if it takes a second to trigger, you might have completely walked through that zone in that second, meaning your zoned lighting or whatever never even gets the chance to trigger. My kitchen where I've used this is a great example, as it's very linear and I've added several functional light strips for specific zones as you pass through. The way I have it set up, when you enter the main kitchen area, the floor level lights always turn on, and then during the daytime the overhead lighting turns on, lighting the entire room. But in the evening I prefer to use just accent lighting, rather than blinding myself with the main overhead lights. So as you walk through you get the ground level lighting, and then specific lights under the cabinets or the sink turn on as you stand in each zone. And this whole setup was originally enabled by the power of zones on the Aqara FP2. Now it does have its own flaws. Often when stood in a zone and someone else enters that zone and leaves, it assumes that the second person consumed the first and marks that zone as empty, turning the lights off on the first person. It can also quite often leave ghosts behind and never turn the lights off, unless you get the zone setup absolutely nailed, which is quite a learning curve. But after years of trial and error, more often than not, it works pretty well for me. However, I never had this problem with the LinknLink, leaving the area always turn the lights off. I had hoped that this new sensor from LinknLink would be the sensor to solve all these problems, and that these flaws I'd been living with would finally be a thing of the past. But it turns out that this precise radar positioning stuff is hard to do well. And in my opinion, Aqara does still do it better. Especially right now, as I was editing this video, Aqara released a big update to the FP2s, improving on several of these weaknesses, including that ghost situation. I've yet to fully test this, but hopefully it's going to be an improvement. But here's a big thing that's definitely worth considering: the price. This LinknLink eMotion Max, their top of the line sensor, is roughly half the price of what the FP2 typically retails for. So if you are in the market for a mmWave presence sensor with zone control, take 1 second to run through everything I have just said in your head again, because your choice between the eMotion and the FP2 currently comes down to this: do I want to pay twice the price to save myself 1 second each time I enter a zone? And yes, I say currently because this 1 second is merely a software flaw with the eMotion, which, given enough feedback, LinknLink could decide to change. I have in fact just received an email today from my contact at LinknLink, and they said they are taking this criticism under advisement. They basically echoed exactly what I said about this being quite a technical challenge, and one that presence sensors as a whole with zone detection do all encounter and try to deal with in subtly different ways. So they're always optimizing this software to try and improve it. So this is definitely something that could change in future. But I do stick to my typical opinion that you should never buy a product based on the promise of what it can do in the future. That said, if you'd still like to buy either of these sensors and try them out for yourself, the links will be on my website as always, and tagged to this video on my homepage for a while, or just search for LinknLink in the product search. As always, I hope you found this video useful or helpful in some way, and if you did, please consider supporting the channel in any way that you can using the links at the bottom of my homepage. And I will of course be eternally grateful. Thank you so much for watching again, and as always, remember, home is where the smart is.